I've been talking lately about the Gala Games blog to keep up with all the things that Gala Games is working on. But if you want to be a part of the Gala Games community, check out the Gala Games Discord server. I'll leave a link in the description so you can join the server and talk to other people in the gaming culture, make new friends, interact with other gamers, and overall just have a great time and keep up to date with Gala Games releases. The link is down below. I did a video on the channel recently about my memories of first buying a Super Nintendo, and I figured I'd do a follow-up about the Sega Genesis, which is the Super Nintendo's 16-bit competitor back in the 90s, otherwise known as the Mega Drive outside of North America. It was called the Mega Drive. And my story with the Sega Genesis is different than a lot of other people's. You know, I originally was a Nintendo kid. I had an Atari 2600 with like 2 games on it, and then my dad got me a Nintendo, an NES, and I played that for years. All the classics. Mario, Zelda, everything from that system, right? And DuckTales. And then, I remember when I was young, I went to, I want to say, I don't remember if it was a Toys R Us, a KB Toys, or a Walmart. This would have been late 80s. I don't remember. But I remember seeing the Sega Genesis there. Not really sure what the Sega Genesis was, but it looked like a Nintendo because I didn't know what a video game system was. I knew a Nintendo and that was it. I was ignorant. And I remember being a really little kid, and I remember seeing, I think it was Altered Beast, that was the original Pac-In game, and it didn't really have much of an effect on me. It really didn't. It didn't impress me. Now, one thing that I've learned about that era is it really came down, like your appreciation of Sega, not just Genesis but as a company, really came down to your upbringing. I didn't really go to the arcades until after the Super Nintendo had come out, and until maybe like 91, 92, right, with Mortal Kombat 1 and Street Fighter and those games back then, other games too, but I didn't really know much about arcades or go to them. So because of that, I was never a kid that really became familiar at that time with Sega's complete dominance over the arcade. Like games like Golden Axe and Afterburner, which I love. I love these games, by the way, but I'm talking about back then. And games like Space Harrier and Altered Beast, I didn't have, I don't know if I had them in my area, but I never went to the arcades. So I didn't have that appreciation. Like, I wasn't one of those kids that played the arcade Sega games and now could play them at home with the Genesis, which was the big selling point of the Genesis. You can bring the arcade home. Granted, a lot of the games were changed from the arcade counterparts. Shinobi, there was their own Shinobi games on the home consoles. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was different. All these games differed, but you still had a home port. Golden Axe had an extra level. But, like I said, I never really was big into the arcades, so I didn't appreciate the Sega Genesis. I feel like if I was older, right, if I was an older kid, I would have really appreciated Genesis. Because really, when you think about it, the Genesis, the Mega Drive, was kind of the system for teenagers. The Nintendo was kind of like a system for kids, but the Genesis really became a system for the teens. Because the difficulty on the Genesis games tended to be a little bit harder. You also had much more, obviously you had the whole blood controversy, how the Genesis had blood and the Nintendo did not for a very long time. Games were technically faster on the Sega. So, older gamers could appreciate it more. It wasn't until Sonic the Hedgehog that I really took notice of the Sega Genesis. And if I remember correctly, my old best friend got himself a Sega Genesis with Sonic the Hedgehog as a packing cart. This would have been sometime around 90, 91. I don't remember because I was really little. And I remember playing Sonic the Hedgehog at his house and loving it. I just remember loving it. And I remember going to another friend of mine's house, and he had a Genesis with Bonanza Brothers, another Sega arcade game. And I loved that. And I just fell in love with the 16-bit graphics and the colors and the sound. I love that look of the Sega Genesis. And I remember at that time I already owned a Super Nintendo, and I figured I didn't need a Sega because I had the Super Nintendo. And I enjoyed my Super Nintendo. I mean, I talked about that in the previous video. Like, I didn't need a Sega Genesis. I didn't appreciate the Sega Genesis library of games until much later on in my gaming life. But when I saw Sonic the Hedgehog, I loved it. And I remember my parents used to always take me to their friend's house, and their friends had two daughters, and their daughters had the Sega Genesis. Remember, I was a Nintendo kid, but I had friends with the Sega Genesis. And they had Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And it was my first time seeing Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and I remember just being blown away. Just everything about it. The colors, Sonic and Tails, you know, the bonus levels with that kind of 3D effect, like, just blew my mind. And I said to myself, like, okay, I want a Sega Genesis. And I asked my parents for one. And I don't remember what year it was, but I remember they bought me a Sega Genesis Model 2. And I remember the early games that I had for that system. And when you think about it, or when I thought about it, the majority of the games that I had were not even arcade ports. Because I didn't have that, like, bond with these games. Later on, I did come to appreciate games like Shinobi and really Afterburner. I played Afterburner at Chuck E. Cheese when I was a little kid, and I totally fell in love with it. I love Afterburner, and honestly, I don't think any home console can really capture the feeling of playing Afterburner in the arcade in the cockpit. When you're in the cockpit holding the stick, it was the closest thing to actually living Top Gun. And I loved Top Gun back then. But really, what really drew me to the Sega Genesis, there was two things. Number one, Sonic the Hedgehog. And number two, Mortal Kombat. Because the big controversy back then was that the Super Nintendo version, although it played a lot smoother and looked and sounded better when it came to the arcade port, had no blood. Because Nintendo at the time had a very strict no blood policy for their games. There were games on Super NES like Doom that had no blood. Doom, one of the goriest games ever, especially for those days, had no blood. Meanwhile, Sega Genesis had tons of gore. So, I remember buying Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo, playing it for a while, and then eventually asking for Mortal Kombat on the Sega Genesis. Now, when it came to the Sega Genesis, I remember what my early games were. I think I had 7 games. I think I started with 5. And the games that I had were Sonic 3. I didn't have Sonic 1 or 2, even though I should have gotten them, but I didn't have them back then. Sonic 3, Echo the Dolphin, X-Men, which I loved. I loved the old X-Men game on Sega Genesis. Sonic Spinball, love that game. And I think the 5th game that I owned, now looking back on it, only was 5 games, was Sonic and Knuckles. But I would often borrowed games from my friends, but really, Sega Genesis became the Sonic the Hedgehog machine. Me being a little kid, obviously the mascots were what I was into. You know, I loved Mario and Link, and on Sega Genesis, it was really lots of Sonic. I mean, I just named 3 Sonic games. Oh, and of course, Mortal Kombat. But really, I would borrow games from my friends, like Streets of Rage 2. I love Streets of Rage 2. I borrowed Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition, even though it was the same as Super Street Fighter 2, or Street Fighter 2 Turbo, that is, not Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on Super NES. I think one of the Double Dragons I borrowed too. It was a long time ago. But I really came to appreciate the Sega Genesis library when I got into emulation. That's when I got to play. Well, no, I actually did borrow Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. That was the other game I borrowed. But it was really when I got to play stuff like Altered Beast, Revenge of Shinobi, Contra Hardcore, Castlevania Bloodlines. When I got to play through those games, that's when I really got to appreciate the Sega Genesis. And even though there was a, quote, console war going on back then, the Sega Genesis My memories of it initially was to play Sonic the Hedgehog. But now looking back on it, I appreciate that library so much more. The Shinobi games, all three of them, were a lot of fun on that system. Even though I still prefer Ninja Gaiden and Strider. And speaking of which, Strider was a great arcade port. Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3. All the Sonic 2D games. All the shoot-em-ups that were on the system. Contra, TMNT, the Hyperstone Heist. Sunset Riders. Sega Genesis had a lot of great games on it. And I really appreciated it because for a long time, it was the only way to play these arcade games. Unless you went to the arcade. You couldn't play Golden Axe. I mean, I love Golden Axe, but I didn't really appreciate it until the mid-90s emulation scene. And I'm talking about the mid-90s, not even like the late 90s. I'm talking about when you would go to the library and download a ROM onto a floppy disk, then bring it home with you. That's what I'm talking about, yo. I would download one game. I think it was like one game, or maybe two games a day. You know what I'm saying? Because you couldn't fit, like now you fit 18,000 ROMs on one SD card. Maybe more than that. Back then it was 2 ROMs, maybe one per disc, floppy disk. This is how long ago we're talking about here. And that's when I got to explore the Sega Genesis library of games. And really, I was never a Sega kid. I was always a Nintendo kid. But later on, I got to appreciate what Sega had done for the world. I owned a Dreamcast, never had a Saturn. And I also purchased a Sega CD and a 32X when I was a kid, which I'll get into that in a separate video. But the early Sega Genesis for me, which is a Sonic console. But like I said, appreciating the games that were on there later on. The Golden Axes, the Streets of Rage, the shooters. These games were not available on Super or on Nintendo systems. The sports titles like Mutant League Football, Mutant League Hockey. I always felt like had I gone from NES to Sega Genesis then to Super Nintendo, I would have been able to appreciate it more. But back then, I didn't have a Master System. I never even knew what the Master System was. Because Nintendo had dominated the 8-bit market so much that I didn't even know what it was. I was very casual until much later. And even though I feel like the Super Nintendo overall was smoother and had more colors, the Sega Genesis had these exclusives that I just totally adored. And to this day, I mean, there's still a lot of them on there. Mega Turrican, there's so many. And so I look fondly on the Genesis. In my opinion, that was Sega's best system. I mean, you could make an argument the Dreamcast. I mean, the Dreamcast and the Saturn, especially the Japanese Saturn, all had a great library of games. But when it came to having the best overall software, the best and biggest selection of great games, the Genesis was it, bro. You know what I mean? You could make an argument that, they ported a lot of those games over to like PS2, PSP. You can play those Sega games a million different ways. But if it wasn't for that original Genesis library, that's really the key. And I think I would have appreciated a lot more back then if I was more adult. Like if I was older, if I was maybe a teenager or even younger than that, maybe like maybe like a 12, 13. But in 1990 I was 6, so it wasn't really a thing for me. But now I've been playing a lot of the old games again, and I really do appreciate them a hell of a lot more than I did back then. So it's a great library. Those are my memories of the Sega Genesis. And what do you think? What are your memories of Genesis Mega Drive? Any games you really enjoy on there? I mean, I have tons. I just didn't go through them all because I could be talking about this forever. And we'll talk soon.